everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about Torquebox, which is the way we're going to be running Ruby on Rails on top of JBoss. So first a little background about myself, then we'll jump into this. I'm Bob McWhorter, if anyone here is not an employee of Red Hat. I'm the guy behind Drools originally and the Code House. So anyhow, I've developed an interest in Ruby on Rails and I work for JBoss, so we decided let's find a way to run Ruby on Rails on top of JBoss. Ruby on Rails, for those of y'all who have not done it before, it's a model view controller framework, one of the more popular ones for Ruby. It satisfies the whole web tier as far as defining your models and having templates for your views and controllers to actually do work. One of the reasons Rubyists really like Ruby on Rails is because of the terseness of code and how quickly you can develop code and see it running live and get back to development, and you just keep going back and forth without having to redeploy your application or restart your server very much. But like I mentioned, Ruby on Rails really only addresses the web space, people coming to your app from the browser. So the premise of what I'm doing here is that since Ruby on Rails has only really looked at the web space and it's relatively immature, and it's never really had an application server, that's something we could address. And thankfully, the JRuby guys have put together a really nice Ruby interpreter that runs on top of the JVM. And so we combine that to our JBoss server and leverage all of the enterprise stuff that we get from J2EE. And we can use it for Ruby. So some of the goals approaching this was to make sure that we can still allow Rubyists to develop the way they want to. Not force them to actually create a WAR file and throw it into the server, but to actually work with their Rails root just right as it sits on disk, and still be able to edit their files and make changes and see them live. And then also, since we have a whole app server that we can play with, we wanted to kind of provide more functionality than Rails alone provides. Because JBoss does more than just the web stuff. It's more than just servlets. We've got JMS in there. We've got SOAP in there. We've got all sorts of things that we can expose for Rubyists to enjoy. It's all built on JBoss AS5 and based upon microcontainer. Since microcontainer has this concept of deployers, we can basically set up any Java service from recognizing things on our Rails project. You don't have to go through the normal web.xml to set up a website and things like that. The flexibility microcontainer allows us to deploy the same JEE things, but doing it in a different kind of method by not using XML files, basically. And so our deployers, when you deploy a Rails app, it's still propping up servlets and filters and message queues, but we're not having to do it the traditional Java way. So our requirements for any Rails app that's going to be running on Torquebox is we need to have Rails 2.2 or higher. At that point, that means 2.2 or 2.3. You can't have native gems, and those are going to be gems that are going to be using C code, so you have to have pure Ruby gems at this point. Coming down the line, they have the FFI, the Foreign Function Interface, which is actually a way that the JVM can interface with C code, and it also works for the Ruby interpreters. So once we have FFI-based native gems, you will be able to use them in either C Ruby, traditional Ruby, or you could use them in JRuby. Sorry, I think my phone's making noise. And then you have to do it on JBoss AS5. It will not work in AS4. So the basics behind Rails is that we develop in an exploded directory tree called Rails root. That's just the top of your application code. We don't have to create WAR files. We don't have to make packages. We don't have to do bundles. You just have your directory tree there that has all of your code scattered amongst it. Changes made to your models or your views or your controllers are immediately reflected right there in the live running app. There's no need to redeploy or restart anything. So we're going to do a little overview of just Rails itself. So here are like models in Rails. For the most part, attributes that are in a database, if we're talking about strings or booleans or anything like that, you don't even have to think about them in your Ruby class that matches that model. Those are pulled from the database, it's inspected, and you just have it. The only thing you really have to describe in your model classes is relationships, like between tables. So here we see that a thing may have many other things. So they'll link a thing row to many other rows in the other thing table. It may belong to a person, so that's like a one-to-many or a one-to-one relationship. And there's several different types of relationships that Ruby gives you to kind of describe the object format that you want to see from your tabular data. Views are they're what we call ERB templates, embedded Ruby templates. And they're just like regular HTML files, but inside your brackets with the %, you can put Ruby expressions. And you can, like here, if we have a thing, we can get its name and just display it right there in your template. Very similar to like Model 1 JSP. Controllers get a little more complex. Rails tries to be RESTful, at least for its definition of RESTfulness. And so when you create the first controller, like for any given resource, it'll blow out a series of these methods, like the index method, which just lists all of the things that you have. There's a show method that will show a single one. There's create and update and things like that. And right here, all we're going to show you is the index method. And here, like the first line you see, we're fetching all of the things. And then if the request is a RESTful request for HTML, we just render the HTML template. If it's a request for an XML, we render the object tree as XML and there are no templates involved. Likewise, you can do similar with like JSON if you wanted to have a list of things come out as a JSON tree. That's just another format.json, and it will look at the content type and render it appropriately. Well, not the content type, but the extension on your URL. We'll get to that. So then the TorqueBox server, our actual project that you can download, what we've done is we've bundled up the entirety of JBoss AS5. We've included JRuby, the entirety of that. And then also we have the deployers that make AS5 Rails aware or Ruby aware. And then we have a couple of little utilities that make it easy to manage the server itself. To deploy an application, I say we don't have to throw a WAR file into our app server, but we have to give the app server something so it knows that we have an application we want it to deploy. And that's this deployment descriptor. So underneath your deploy directory, you don't drop a WAR file, you drop this YAML file, which kind of takes the place of a web.xml, where here you see we're binding it to the context, the root context of the app server. You can throw in a virtual host here, but by default it'll just bind to all the hosts. And then we also have to point to what I said, the Rails root. This is the directory on disk where your app actually lives. The Rails end is just a method Ruby uses or Rails uses to have different configurations. You might have your development configuration and a production configuration and a staging configuration, where each one may have different, let's say, URLs or database names that go into it. When you're in development mode, you get more debug, more logging statements, where in production you don't. When you're running in production mode also, a lot of this, the dynamic reloading is stopped just because you don't want to check files all the time. You're in production, you're not expecting any live changes, so there's no real reason to check them all the time for changes. So deploy, it's basically you throw this 5-line file into your deploy directory, and AS5 notices that and it will stand up your application from your app living somewhere else on your disk. Of course, it's a 5-line file, but it's a little more complex than I personally want to write. So as I said, we have these utilities that make it very easy to deploy the app you're currently working on. Rake is kind of Ruby's equivalent of make or ant. It's just a little thing that can run a task for you from the command line. And we ship these tasks called TorqueBox Server Deploy. And all that does is you run it from within your app directory, and it will go off to JBoss and scribble that 5-line file for you, and it's done. You know, app server doesn't have to be running, it's just writing a file, and that's all it does. So then you actually want to run the server, and once again, you use TorqueBox Server Run for this one, or if you wanted to, you can start JBoss like you normally do with run.sh or run.bat. So JBoss will boot up, and it runs. And so now we're going to take a quick look at the live application. Yep, so here, this is AS is running. You can ignore the output right now. We'll get to that point. But I already have the AS running. It's noticed the Rails app descriptor there, and it's stood up the app. Then we can go over here to our browser. And that index method that I showed you, that fetches all of the things and then displays them. Here, I've already created some things. We can make that a little larger. You know, we can create other things, like a chair. So that's relatively simple. That works just the way Rails applications works. Nothing too special going there. It's almost boring. So let's edit some code live, because that's really one of the great features about Rails is that you can edit code live and not have to redeploy, not have to rebundle, not have to compile or anything. So we can go over here. And let's edit looking at a single one of these things. So that's going to be our show template. So that's like here, if we click show, we're looking at this. That's rendered from the template that we see here. And maybe we want to make it a little prettier. So we will just go over here and change, make it a header.